The United States Senate has once again declined to authorize a war powers resolution against President Trump regarding military operations in Iran, marking the fourth such vote on the matter. Congressional correspondent Toraine Small reports that bipartisan support for constraining the president's military authority remains limited, with only one Republican senator joining Democratic colleagues in the effort.
The Senate did not authorize invocation of war powers against President Trump for the war in Iran. I want to turn to Capitol Hill correspondent, congressional reporter Torian Small. Torian, how did it go down?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing time after time when it comes to these war powers resolution is that there just isn't a bipartisan appetite to really rebuke the president in this way. We've only seen so far one Republican really join with Democrats in this call to rein in the president's war powers, especially as it relates to this conflict with Iran. That's Senator Rand Paul, who's had his tiffs with the president previously, so this wasn't really a surprising vote by him.
Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who has previously clashed with the administration on foreign policy matters, was the sole Republican to support the resolution. His vote was not unexpected given his established record of advocating for congressional oversight of military engagements. However, this most recent Senate action stands in contrast to broader congressional developments regarding executive authority. A separate resolution has emerged from Congress that legislative observers describe as historically significant in the context of executive-legislative branch relations. This measure addresses multiple domains of presidential power simultaneously, including war powers authorities, emergency declarations used to implement trade tariffs, and broader constitutional accountability questions that have characterized the Trump administration's approach to governance.
U.S. Constitution. Under the War Powers Resolution of 1973, the U.S. President has 60 days to obtain authorization from Congress to either continue military action or withdraw troops. The deadline that expires on May 1st has been heavily disputed among lawmakers. While some argue that the president can extend military involvement for 30 days, others, like the U.S. Secretary of Defense, say the ceasefire period is not included in the 60-day countdown.
However, we are in a ceasefire right now, which our understanding means the 60-day clock pauses or stops in a ceasefire.
The resolution's architects designed it with specific legal considerations in mind, drawing upon recent judicial rulings that have limited certain executive actions. Unlike previous measures that were ultimately vetoed without lasting legal effect, this resolution incorporates structural elements intended to maximize institutional pressure and legal durability. The political coalition supporting this resolution differs markedly from previous efforts. Lawmakers who have consistently supported the administration on prior votes found the specific combination of issues addressed in this measure sufficient to warrant their support for congressional oversight, representing a potential shift in the legislative landscape regarding executive authority. The constitutional foundation for these developments rests upon the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which mandates that the President obtain congressional authorization within 60 days of initiating military hostilities or withdraw forces. The current deadline, set to expire May 1st, has generated dispute among legal and policy experts regarding its application during periods of ceasefire. Some administration officials, including the Secretary of Defense, maintain that ceasefire periods do not count toward the 60-day limitation. Democratic lawmakers dispute this interpretation, noting that United States forces continue to maintain a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which they characterize as ongoing military engagement requiring congressional authorization. The current resolution exists within a broader pattern of congressional efforts to constrain the administration's use of emergency powers and unilateral executive action across multiple policy areas. The War Powers Resolution was originally enacted in response to the Vietnam War experience, when presidential commitment of military forces to extended conflict occurred without formal congressional declaration of war. The statute established notification requirements and the 60-day framework to ensure legislative branch oversight of military engagements. Members of both parties have supported war powers measures targeting the Iran campaign, asserting that Article 1 of the Constitution grants Congress exclusive authority to declare war. Separately, Congress has attempted to terminate national emergency declarations that serve as the legal basis for comprehensive tariff programs, though these efforts have previously faced presidential vetoes that override attempts failed to overturn. The current resolution represents a departure from this pattern of unsuccessful challenges, according to legislative analysts, because of its comprehensive scope and the evolving judicial context in which it operates. The measure draws upon recent Supreme Court determinations regarding the limits of executive tariff authority and integrates these findings with documented congressional opposition to military operations in Iran. Historically, congressional challenges to presidential power have frequently demonstrated political will without achieving legal constraints on executive behavior. Presidents have regularly contested war powers requirements. Emergency declarations have survived legislative challenges through vetoes, and impeachment proceedings have fallen short of conviction thresholds. The current resolution attempts to break this pattern through its specific legal architecture and the political moment in which it emerges. The resolution's significance lies in its integration of multiple constitutional mechanisms into a single legislative action. The war powers provisions invoke the 1973 statute to assert that congressional authority over military force remains enforceable and cannot be nullified through claims of inherent executive authority. This represents the most formal invocation of the war powers resolution since its enactment 5 decades ago, according to constitutional scholars. The emergency tariff provisions address a separate but equally consequential domain of executive power. The Trump administration has utilized emergency authorities under various statutes to impose tariffs affecting trade relationships with numerous countries, generating substantial economic and political consequences. The legal basis for these tariffs rests upon delegated congressional authority under specified emergency conditions. Lawmakers from both parties have questioned whether the declared emergencies meet statutory definitions, arguing that the tariff program exceeds the scope of authority actually delegated by Congress. Previous resolutions to terminate these emergency declarations passed in one or both chambers, but were subsequently vetoed. The Supreme Court has ruled that certain tariff actions exceeded statutory authority, providing judicial foundation for the current resolution's legislative assertions. The combination of war powers and emergency tariff challenges within a single resolution gives the measure its comprehensive character. By addressing military action and international trade policy simultaneously, Congress is asserting constitutional authority across domains that represent core assertions of executive power. The composition of the voting coalition provides essential context for understanding the resolution's political significance. Previous bipartisan challenges to executive actions have typically drawn support from a predictable group of Republican critics, alongside unified Democratic opposition. This pattern allowed administration allies to characterize opposition as motivated by personal animosity rather than constitutional principle. The current resolution attracted support from Republican lawmakers who have historically been reliable administration allies, representing a qualitative shift in the political landscape. These members indicated that the specific combination of war powers concerns, emergency authority questions, and accountability provisions reached a threshold they could not support from either a constitutional or constituent perspective. This expansion beyond the usual critics makes the administration's standard response, characterizing opposition as partisan obstruction, significantly more difficult to sustain. When long-standing allies break with the administration on constitutional questions regarding executive authority, the political calculation shifts for future legislative disputes. The Supreme Court's recent rulings on executive trade authority provide crucial legal context for the tariff provisions. The Court has determined that certain applications of emergency tariff authority exceed statutory authorization, establishing that the emergency powers claimed as legal basis for the comprehensive tariff regime are more limited than the administration has asserted. These judicial determinations operate within the legal framework of the current resolution. When Congress asserts that emergency tariff authority does not extend to the administration's claims, this legislative action aligns with judicial assessment of statutory limits. The resolution thus functions not merely as a political statement regarding trade policy preferences, but as legislative enforcement of judicially recognized constraints on executive authority. The constitutional provisions invoked, war powers statutes, emergency authority frameworks, and accountability mechanisms, operate as integrated components of the checks and balances system designed to prevent excessive concentration of power in any single branch. The resolution represents a comprehensive assertion that executive actions across military, trade, and emergency domains have reached a threshold requiring legislative response through the full range of available constitutional tools. The resolution's architects designed the measure to resist dismissal as symbolic or absorption through standard veto procedures. The legal and political stakes of the current moment, according to legislative analysts, require more than statements that can be bypassed without altering fundamental power dynamics between the branches. The passage of this resolution establishes three significant developments for the ongoing relationship between the legislative and executive branches. First, the measure represents the most comprehensive congressional assertion of constitutional authority against executive overreach during the current administration. Previous challenges focused on discrete policy areas, specific military engagements, particular emergency declarations, or isolated accountability mechanisms. Each faced absorption by the administration as targeted opposition rather than systematic constitutional objection. By addressing war powers claims, emergency tariff authority, and accountability questions within a single legislative action, the resolution argues that the pattern of executive overreach itself constitutes the constitutional problem, requiring a response commensurate with its scope. This comprehensive approach is inherently more difficult to dismiss than single-issue challenges. Second, the specific members supporting the resolution carry significance beyond the numerical vote count. The composition of the coalition indicates a shift in Republican support for the administration's executive power claims. Previous bipartisan challenges relied upon a small group of established Republican critics, enabling administration allies to attribute opposition to personal rather than constitutional motivations. The inclusion of reliable administration allies who broke with the president for the first time on this measure alters this dynamic. These members reached a threshold where they could not defend the specific combination of constitutional concerns to themselves or their constituents, signaling potential evolution in the political support structure underlying the administration's authority claims. Third, the resolution establishes a new baseline for congressional challenges to presidential power that will influence future disputes between the branches. Prior to this vote, the political landscape was defined by challenges that drew bipartisan support without achieving margins necessary for consequential rather than symbolic effect. This created conventional wisdom holding that Congress could express opposition without actually constraining core executive power claims. The current coalition demonstrates that a consequential challenge can be assembled within the present political environment, altering calculations for future legislative disputes, executive power assertions, and judicial evaluations of constitutional limits. Members considering whether to support future challenges, administration officials weighing aggressive executive action, and courts assessing constitutional boundaries will all operate within this changed context. The administration's anticipated response faces specific challenges given the resolution's legal architecture. Administration officials are expected to argue that the resolution violates separation of powers by constraining constitutional presidential authority as commander-in-chief and chief executive responsible for foreign policy and international trade. They may contest the constitutionality of war powers limitations and defend emergency tariff authority as properly invoked under relevant statutes, potentially vetoing the resolution or challenging its provisions in court. However, these responses encounter a more difficult legal environment than previous administration challenges to congressional oversight. Supreme Court precedent has already established limits on executive tariff authority. The documented record of military action without congressional authorization strengthens war powers arguments beyond previous invocations. The coalition composition, including reliable administration allies, complicates efforts to characterize opposition as partisan obstruction. The resolution's architects designed the measure with this history of unsuccessful challenges in mind, incorporating structural elements intended to make it more resistant to absorption, dismissal, or veto without consequence than previous efforts. The broader coalition, stronger legal alignment with judicial determinations, and the accumulated record of executive actions following consistent judicial pushback create conditions favorable to consequential congressional action. The resolution represents the institutional expression of evolving constitutional dynamics during the current political era. The administration's legal and political response will likely constitute a significant constitutional development, with specific provisions potentially generating judicial challenges. Constitutional experts will closely evaluate whether the resolution's legal architecture can withstand anticipated administration efforts to nullify its effect, making the forthcoming institutional interaction a closely watched element of the ongoing separation of powers narrative.